SpongeBob SquarePants has had its share of ups and downs over the years, both on the television side and in its deep library of video games. Seasons 1 to 3 of the show, as well as the heavy iron video game releases, have been received positively throughout the years by both the SpongeBob community and the general public. On the negative side, we have the behavior interactive games you see on the screen, as well as the majority of episodes published after the first theatrical movie. With all those ups and downs, however, it's easy for something average to get lost. In 2006, Blitz Games published SpongeBob Creature from the Krusty Krab, a mostly average variety platformer from a company that was pretty great at making mostly average platformers. There were definitely interesting ideas in that title, and even though Blitz Games was behind the production of the console titles, the ideas were also used in the GBA counterpart, which was handled by a different team. You know, it wouldn't usually surprise me that a handheld counterpart to a licensed console game would go almost completely forgotten by just about everyone in the nearly 11 years since its release, but it kinda does surprise in this case, and here's why. Quite a few SpongeBob games were released on Nintendo's rectangular game-playing piece of machinery, including Super Sponge, developed by Climax Group, the handheld versions of Battle for Bikini Bottom and Revenge of the Flying Dutchman, developed by Future Skylanders developers Vicarious Visions, and finally, the portable renditions of the SpongeBob movie game and Creature from the Krusty Krab from WayForward. Yeah, WayForward Technologies. To this day, WayForward splits time between working on their original IPs like Shantae and license work, and it happens that they were very involved with the Sponge during the THQ years. With such a talented team behind the GBA version, it had the potential to show the world that a handheld version of a licensed game could not only be good for a licensed game, but good in general. Because the GBA was more similar to a SNES internally than any modern console at the time, it was reasonable for this version to have limitations, and instead of attempting something that wouldn't have worked well on the console, WayForward did what they do best, a 2D platformer. More specifically in this case, a 2D variety platformer, because you're not going to be doing the same thing for very long in most cases. WayForward's skill here shows right off the bat too, as the sprites here are phenomenal. They're expressive, have a ton of variety in facial expressions, and actually look better than a lot of games have experienced on the console. Especially compared to previous SpongeBob games developed by other studios and most of the Mario Advance games that in most cases reused sprites from the SNES collections. Even the backgrounds are very detailed and fit the tone of what each level is trying to accomplish. I'd go as far to say that this title challenges the original GBA version of Mario & Luigi's Superstar Saga on how good the visuals look, which is a very good thing on a console where some games look about as detailed as an NES game. Even with the quality of the sprites though, some have noted that they're less stylized than the visuals of the console brother. While I agree with that in general, the stills between levels and backgrounds usually represent the weird visual style from the consoles well, and it's well enough that I personally don't see it as a problem. Also, since they look less like something only a madman would draw, they look more like the cartoon, and I see that as something that can only be a positive. Creature GBA is also slightly more advanced technically than previous SpongeBob entries on the handheld. While BFBB, Revenge of the Flying Dutchman, and the movie game are all games that used a password system to keep track of progress made, this entry used a save battery, which is something most people would have taken for granted at the time because by 2006 most of the GBA library had save capabilities, but it's notable nonetheless since its predecessors didn't have the feature due to apparent limitations in development during the early GBA life. Well, either that or they decided it wasn't worth the cost to add the feature. Hard to say as an outsider, but since some Game Boy and Game Boy Color games had saving, it's probably more the latter. Speaking of limitations, let's return to presentation to talk about the music. Even though it's a bit compressed to fit the hardware, listening to it on a GBA speaker is absolutely fine, and I generally enjoy listening to the tracks, even if they aren't especially memorable. The game was composed by Shinen Multimedia. Yeah, that's Shinen Multimedia, the developers of the Fast Racing series on WiiWare, Wii U, and Nintendo Switch. Weird, but cool, I guess. Getting into the actual game, it's a 2D platformer in general, but it's a game, not unlike its console brother, that likes to try different things almost every time you blink, because the plot is just different dreams from our protagonists and antagonists. To start the game, you're thrown into Diesel Dreaming, which to start is a 2D racer with 3 mini-bosses and platforming, and then it changes to a 3D section where you avoid oncoming hazards. After that, your car breaks and you have to platform on clouds to find pieces to fix your car. After that, you fall off a cliff. Alright. And both avoid jellyfish and gain health while falling. In the second level, you're Patrick the Starfish Man, and you start with a 2D beat-em-up segment. and then you evolve the level by moving to a flying section where you maneuver around obstacles. After that, it's a beat-em-up segment on top of a train that reminds me of Arkham City's bonus train missions. Finally, it's a boss that both tests skills that you've learned through the level and makes sure you're quick to react to hazards in preparation for an auto-scroll style platforming challenge in the next level. It's variety that's extremely well done, and it continues through the game. I'm not going to go by level, but throughout the game you'll do that auto-scroll style platforming level, fight a killer Krabby Patty while avoiding condiments in an incredibly fun boss area, get eaten by a worm, and play a Galaga-style shooter in space. Changing the play style so often never seemed forced. In fact, the game actually made it seem natural and something crucial to the game experience. There were three main reasons that WayForward nailed the majority of these sections. First is that the controls were easy to pick up and play, something not only crucial in a handheld title, but something extremely important in a variety platformer. They managed to change up controls often but keep each transition smooth, not to mention every different playstyle is polished in the control sense, so it just feels nice to play. For example, the area where you play as Patrick in space had 4 different parts to it, all with their own completely different set of controls, and I found all of them easy to get used to and complementary of their respective level designs. Second is that the levels were usually the perfect length, pace, and difficulty. When it comes to platformers, the level length is important, because if someone's stuck on one level or area too long, in my experience, they usually lose interest in continuing. This is especially important though in 2D platformers, because some games feel way too slowly paced because the levels are way too long and slow. Looking at you, Yoshi's Woolly World. WayForward did a good job in making sure that not only were the levels the right length, but the individual segments were too. This way, the game never feels stale or repetitive, and the replayability is also much higher. This is something I actually feel the console version struggled with, which is a topic for a different day, but I'm content with pretty much all the levels in this version in this regard. Finally, and I touched on this earlier, but the game is great at making sure you pick up on mechanics through the game to reuse later in high-pressure situations. The sections aren't just well done on their own the first time around, but most are actually important for you to learn mechanically, as the final stages will test what you learned throughout the game. As each level is replayable, I found myself going back to revisit previous levels just to polish my skills in preparation for the long final boss area. This clever level design culminating into one endurance challenge made for really entertaining gameplay, and it made it really rewarding when I finally completed the boss. Now, there are a few issues with the game. The level where SpongeBob gets eaten by a bullworm has a couple minor things that irritate me. The first problem with this level is that the difficulty spike is a bit too high coming from the previous level. I would have preferred a level in between the relatively straightforward platforming level behind it and this maze-style design. With the dream story being completely random anyway, why not add one more little section in just to help the difficulty curve become more natural? In addition, there are these little germs that latch onto you and gradually suck your health until you die or almost die, and they don't tell you how to shake them off, which is rapid fire left and right on the D-pad. Not a huge deal, but it did make the first few playthroughs of this level more frustrating than they had to be while I figured out how to get rid of these things, which are unavoidable in parts of the level. This would easily be fixed by a little graphic on screen, or including it at the beginning level control screen where every other control mechanic is listed. Because without this normally fast-paced game just screeches to a bit of a halt here. Adding to that minor frustration when playing the bullworm level is that there are non-optional floating bubbles you have to ride, and it, again, makes the normally faster gameplay slow down too much. I would have much preferred that they went at a quicker speed so I didn't have to waste time going through areas I knew how to do, only to be restricted by something I couldn't control. This game has issues, but generally it's a well above average game that not only feels home at the higher tier of my GBA collection, but would benefit from a re-release on a console, whether through an HD remake or a virtual console release. That's actually really impressive to see from a licensed handheld entry, and it makes this game an important example of how handheld games can shine. The licensed game market has a really bad reputation from the rest of the gaming industry a lot of the time, usually because the games don't have a lot of effort put into the finished product. The stereotypical finished product, which we'll call generic licensed game 37 and place on some console, it'll be developed by a studio that develops games for next to no money, in the hopes of making an easy profit for the publisher. The graphics will stink, the gameplay will be boring, and the game will be forgettable, but it'll sell some units because generic cartoon dude 305 stars in it. Now, there are obviously licensed games that don't fall into the stereotype, for example the Batman Arkham series, but the cheap, terrible games do exist and outnumber the good ones, and as a result, these shovelware games make the whole licensed game situation look terrible. Now, let's imagine that generic licensed game 37 is on a handheld instead of a console. The potential for that game looks even worse on paper, because most licensed GBA games are better off for use as spare parts and construction than gameplay. Look at the Game Boy Advance version of MLB 2K7, a game that whatever studio 2K hired to develop literally didn't bother to animate properly. It, and many other GBA games, were just sold as cash-grabbing attempts to fool people into thinking it was decent by using the same box art as the console version. And that right there is what makes Creature from the Krusty Krab for the Game Boy Advance so interesting. It's a completely different game than the console counterpart, even though it shares some of the same ideas. It clearly cares about being faithful to both the show's source material and the console ideas, but it also manages to be a great experience without any of that. WayForward put a whole new SpongeBob experience into this cartridge, and the rare amount of effort put into this handheld version of a licensed game makes it a notable entry in both the GBA library and the SpongeBob video game catalog. It's a great look at what a handheld licensed title can achieve, and I hope that I can continue to find games with this much effort put into them on portable devices, whether it be through 3DS, smartphones, or a future unannounced system. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, I'd really appreciate you hitting the like button. I'm working on the next video starting just a couple days after this goes up, so if you want to see more, please hit that subscribe button and the bell to get notifications. Also, I'd love to hear from you directly, whether it's through Twitter at PatrickMSports or the comments below. I hope you have a fantastic rest of the day.